Good morning. On behalf of the Parkland Board of Trustees, I am delighted to extend a warm welcome to all of you. I would like to take a few moments to recognize some of our current trustees who are able to join us today. We have James Ayers from Monticello. Mr. Ayers can wave his hand. We have Maureen Banks from Champaign. Bianca Green from Champaign. Carolyn Ragsdale from Champaign. And Jaden Campbell, who is our student trustee. We also have with us former trustee Lynn Waffle. We are so glad that all of you, trustees, current and former, Parkland faculty and staff, students, including our summer start participants, retirees, and just good friends of Parkland. We are so glad that you have joined us today for this college-wide celebration of Juneteenth. Juneteenth, also known as Freedom Day and Emancipation Day, commemorates the end of slavery in the United States. It was on June 19th in 1865 that the last enslaved individuals in this country, specifically in the state of Texas, finally learned that they were free. So here at Parkland College, Juneteenth is a day where we take the time not only to celebrate the end of slavery, but also to honor the resilience of African Americans, to acknowledge their great contributions to this country, and to join them in the continuous journey toward equality, justice, and equity for all. Education is an integral part of this ongoing journey. So here at Parkland, Juneteenth is a reminder that our work in opening access to higher education, in providing relevant and viable post-secondary options, and in supporting students in the pursuit of their academic goals, all of these play an all-important role in the larger collective effort. Our special celebration today is particularly momentous, as we have the privilege of welcoming Dr. Zelema Harris, Parkland's third president, as our 2024 Juneteenth speaker. Dr. Harris's professional biography is included in this morning's program, and I believe you'll have a copy of it with you. As you read it, it reminds us that Dr. Harris is a visionary educator who has made a mark in Illinois and on the national stage. And in doing so, she elevated Parkland College. Just this past weekend, while at a local Juneteenth celebration in Douglas Park, a lady came up to me to say, years ago, she used to work with the AACC, the American Association of Community Colleges in Washington, D.C. And she said, Parkland College was and is known as a premier college. That has a lot to do with Dr. Harris's leadership and the legacy that she built and left for us to continue. I will allow you to read Dr. Harris's bio at your own leisure. Instead, this morning, I'd like to introduce her by way of touching upon 4 hallmarks of her legacy that I believe has made Parkland stand out and which have personally impacted me. The first hallmark, access and success. Dr. Harris's work at Parkland was marked by the cross-cutting themes of access and success. She emphasized that our work as the Community College of District 505 was to welcome all students, regardless of their academic background, and that we were to support them in the classroom and outside of the classroom so that they may experience the joy of learning and the thrill of achieving academic success. When I first came to Parkland College in 1995, I came to find part-time work to supplement family income. It was intended to be a temporary employment opportunity. At that point, I had little to no understanding of the mission of community colleges. But as I have said on many occasions and in many venues, I came, I drank the Kool-Aid, and I stayed. And guess what? That Kool-Aid recipe was put together by Dr. Harris. This egalitarian approach to post-secondary education truly resonated with me. I found my professional home. The second hallmark of Dr. Harris's legacy is professional development. Dr. Harris strongly believed that a college's ability to achieve excellence in its academic programs is in part dependent on how well we support faculty, how well we help them to facilitate learning in the classroom, how well we help them keep abreast of the ever-changing needs of students. The Center for Excellence in Teaching and Learning, CETL to many of us, is Dr. Harris's brainchild. CETL initially focused on faculty, on teaching and learning, but in time, its work expanded to include staff professional development. I recall the very early days of the center, which started in the C Wing. For those of you who have been around for a while, you will remember that too. It was CETL that welcomed me as a part-time faculty member who had actually very little experience in working with developmental students. It was at CETL I learned the meaning of facilitating the learning process. And it was at CETL that I learned to become a community college educator. The third hallmark, leadership development. Today, growing our own talent and planning for succession is part of our college ethos. It was Dr. Harris who taught us to nurture leaders from within, to keep an eye out for individuals with potential and interest in leadership, and then to open opportunities for career advancement. It was her vision to launch the annual leadership conference back when leadership development in community colleges was not quite yet a thing. Leadership development has continued to be one of our distinctive practices at Parkland. When the spring semester is done and commencement is over, more than 25 Parkland individuals journey out now to a place in Pana, where we spend 3 days together to learn about the college, to understand what leadership entails, and to build relationship networks. The outcomes of leadership development are clear. Since the year 2000, Parkland has produced 12 deans, 6 associate vice presidents, 11 vice presidents, and 4 presidents. And for those of you who are data gurus, in case you want to know, yes, this is the duplicated head count. The last hallmark, core values. In February of the year 2000, under Dr. Harris's guidance, the Parkland Board of Trustees approved Policy 1.02.01, Statement of Values. We call these our core values: honesty and integrity, fairness and just treatment, responsibility, multiculturalism, education, and public trust. To this day, these 6 core values remain the ethical guardrails that guide our work with students and our daily operations. Dr. Harris, in your 16 years as Parkland College's president, you have given us very much to be thankful for. You left us strong foundations to build upon. You have left an indelible mark, not only on the institution, but also on many individuals, and we truly thank you. Please join me, everyone, in welcoming Dr. Harris back to the podium at Parkland College.
Good morning. I have a pretty strong veneer, but seeing all of you and hearing Dr. Lau, I'm practically in tears. That might be old age, I don't know. But I do want to thank you very much, Dr. Lau, for inviting me back for the first time. I've received such an invitation, so I want to thank you. Also, I want to thank Crystal Garrett, the Executive Administrative Assistant, for all of her work in helping me to come back to Parkland. One of the things I want to mention, I was offered a cart to bring me in, And, you know, not that I didn't need it. I was supposed to park further out, but it was my pride. I refused to come here in a cart, so I walked in. It was actually, and let me say, it was so good to see board members, former board member Lynn Warfel, and to see an existing board member I worked with the entire 16 years I was here, Jim Ayers. And the newest, one of the newest board members I knew as a community member, Maureen. And so I'm really glad you're here. And the new board member I haven't met yet. So thank you all very much. It was actually 34 years ago in 1990 that I stood on this stage for the first time to introduce myself as president of Parkland College. So I think I was around 50 years old. I was interviewed when I was 49, and today I'm at 84. So I'm very grateful. Juneteenth is very important to me. It brings back so many childhood memories of families coming together, listening to music, dancing, turning the handle on an ice cream maker and eating barbecue. I was 4 years old when I attended my first Juneteenth celebration in 1944 with my mother and father and 4 older siblings in the deep piney woods of East Texas. It was Weirgate, Texas, a sawmill town of less than 1,000 residents where our family owned a small cotton farm. We also raised sugarcane, coffee beans, corn, and green vegetables. There was also a large fruit orchard with pears, strawberries, figs, and apples. In fact, we grew everything we ate and drank. As my family walked into that wide open clearing in the piney woods for my first Juneteenth celebration, there was a large crowd of Black people of all ages, some dancing to the pulsating music, children my age running around playing various games, and some adults and children jumping rope. I could feel the joy. There was absolute happiness in that East Texas community. I don't recall anyone telling me the history of the celebration, but freedom is still etched into my memory. I was free. I ran away from my parents and climbed on the platform where the band was playing. I danced around and around to the beat of the music while the musicians laughed and egged me on. A crowd gathered around the platform and started clapping to my antics. My father tried to pull me off the platform. He reached for me. I darted behind the musicians. Finally, my father, at my mother's urging, stepped onto the platform and picked me up gently. I think it was the most embarrassing time of my life. It was years later before I learned what the Juneteenth celebration meant to me and other African Americans in Texas. I now consider Juneteenth as American as Independence Day. Both are national holidays. Both included major wars where men died to gain their freedom. One was fought to end slavery, and as currently expressed, to preserve the Union, while the other was for self-rule. The great difference between the two wars is while the colonies declared their independence from Great Britain on July 4th, 1776, slavery still existed. It was not until June 19, 1865, that 250,000 blacks were told that slavery had ended. The Emancipation Proclamation was issued in 1863, 2.5 years earlier. The delay in informing the slaves were for two reasons. First, it was to get the crops planted and harvested by this free labor. And the other reason was the federal government delayed implementation to support the Confederate States. Yet most Americans don't have a clue about Juneteenth. And if they know, it is not considered a part of their history unless their foreparents were enslaved. And now I've lived to see Juneteenth become a national holiday, signed into law on June 17th, 2021 by President Biden. Our schools in Texas were not allowed to teach students about slavery, even the segregated black schools I attended. They were not allowed to include slavery or Negro history in their curricula. I verified this. There are two members of my high school graduating class whose cognition hasn't been affected too much. And I called the one who's about where I am in memory, and I asked her if we learned Black history in high school, and she said, absolutely not. She said, I remember in world history, there was one paragraph about the war between the states. So from grade school through high school, we never learned about our history. In college, at Prairie View A&M, a historically black college supported by the state, apparently they were not allowed to talk about slavery. I had one professor in political science who studied the voting patterns of Negroes, and he taught us about his findings. My family's history is tied closely to slavery, so it allowed me to know more about my lineage and brought me closer to understanding Juneteenth celebration. My father was 73 when I was born. My mother was 33 with 4 young children. Her husband died earlier when her baby was 8 months old. So she saw in my father an opportunity to help her with her children, and he saw in her a young woman with 4 young children. He often said that was his retirement. My father was born in 1866, and that was 1.5 years after Major General Gordon Granger, who served in the Union Army, rode into Galveston, Texas on horseback to inform the slaves they were free. And that was 2.5 years after President Lincoln declared slavery had ended on June 19, 1865. And that date was our first Juneteenth celebration. My father's father, my grandfather, was a slaveholder, and my father's mother, my grandmother Rose, was a slave. My grandmother, like many former slaves, after her freedom was granted, did not leave her little cabin on the plantation. She received nothing, nor did other slaves to help them to live independently once slavery ended. And so, like so many other former slaves, she stayed right there and received nothing. I can see why she made that decision. However, at the same time, slave owners were compensated up to $300 per slave for their loss of property. And that bill was signed in 1862 by President Lincoln to appease the Confederate States before slavery ended. And the most expedient option for my grandmother and other freed slaves was to stay on the land and continue to work under the same conditions, except by law, former slaves had to be paid for their labor. Former slave holders complied with the law, but found a way to avoid a financial burden by charging their former slaves for their housing, food, and other costs. And at the end of harvesting, many of the former slaves owed their former slave holders money. The system of sharecropping became prevalent in several of the previously Confederate states. And that was particularly true in Mississippi and Arkansas. Most former slaves could barely get by, and there are many blacks around my age who lived and worked under this second form of enslavement. In my grandmother's case, she stayed on and had a child by her former slaveholder after slavery had ended, and that child was my father. Rose, my grandmother, lived long years and died in the 1930s before I was born in 1940. I learned this story when I was 10 or 11. I had many questions, and it was confusing to a young child whose grandfather owned slaves and whose grandmother remained a slave, although she had been granted her freedom. Through reading history that was denied me for many years, I've come to terms with what happened to my grandmother and others who faced the same condition. In 1865 to 1877, federal troops were dispatched to the South to ensure that Reconstruction would take place. But then President Rutherford pulled those troops from the South as an agreement with former Confederate states. And the previous former slaves were left to their own devices. And that's when Jim Crow laws were immediately implemented by former Confederate states to curtail the advancement of blacks to maintain the social order under slavery. Many blacks during Reconstruction were elected to public office and to the U.S. Congress. We even had one black senator elected. All of that progress was impeded by those Jim Crow laws that further denied former slaves their rights that were guaranteed under the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment of the Constitution. American history that included slavery, as I mentioned, was not allowed to be taught in schools. So I ask myself, even today, why is it so hard to deny the truth about our history, especially since slavery played such a pivotal role in America becoming a world superpower? Imagine how fast any economy can grow if you didn't have to pay the workers for nearly 250 years of hard labor under inhumane conditions. The slave system did not allow blacks to read and write. I often was embarrassed by the fact that my father could not read or write, but he knew math and he built homes. And it bothered me, so I didn't tell anybody until I read my own history and realized there was a very small percentage of blacks who could read and write during the time he was born. And the most important question I have is why there is such a public outcry for teaching our true history. Today, there are states that have outlawed what they refer to as critical race theory. Governors and state legislators are prohibiting children from learning about Black history, which is embedded in slavery. Slave owners did not want slaves to learn to read and write because the slave system considered that a threat to the system. The well-documented 1619 Project, sponsored by the New York Times, presents a more comprehensive look at American history and includes the roles African Americans played from this country's inception. There is no anger. No one is raising a fist, calling names to former generations of those who enslaved Black people. It was led or is led by an award-winning journalist named Nicole Hannah-Jones. And I can say, as I went through the various curricula, there is nothing in there to take issue with. How it's taught, perhaps, depending on the age level. Sure, faculty have always had the opportunity to create the curricula based on the needs of their classroom and their students. And there is, within the 1619 Project, a curricula for all ages. Now, in addition to that curricula, the project is augmented in a 6-part series on Hulu. I encourage faculty to review this material. It's entertaining and informative and is well documented with leading scholars, census data, and other documents from archives that have never been publicly disclosed. And there's still so much to learn. I'm still learning. I believe in our democracy, and so did my parents. My mother prayed a lot for a better day. My dad simply kept his family away from white people in East Texas. We stayed in our own secure Black community, except on rare occasions when he would stock up on farm supplies and would allow 1 or 2 of the children to go with him. My father's oldest son fought in World War I. He lived in Harlem, New York, and died in 1950 when I was 10 years old. Through the years, I saw the pride of close relatives coming home on furlough in uniforms during World War II. My brother, a medic in the Army, did several tours in Vietnam. He believed in America. I believe the stories of our patriotism should be told as a part of American history. Black Americans have fought in every war to protect our freedom. We are the definition of patriots, true patriots. I now live in a senior independent living apartment along with nearly 100 other seniors. We live apart. We all have our own places. It's a beautiful place with loads of activities. My son and daughter live separately from each other and from me, but are both within 5 minutes from me. So if anything happens, rather than calling 911, I call them so it's not such a fuss with all the residents running out and having something to talk about over lunch or dinner, which I participate in as well. I've developed a friendship with a celebrated regional artist, Oki Anderson, whose work appears on the congressional walls. She is 85 years old, a white woman who is absolutely stunning. She's well-groomed and beautiful. She gave me a book of her drawings called A Pursuit of Equality, chronicling the lives of famous civil rights leaders. Her story gives me hope, and I have always sought stories of hope. And this one, Oki's story, is one of the best yet. I asked her if she could share her story of redemption. Our conversation started with me asking what inspired her to write the book. She told me that her grandson, who was attending Texas A&M University, and with a grandmother's pride said, and he has a 4.0 average on a 4-point scale. I asked her a pointed question. He asked her a pointed question about her life. Momo, he said, I don't want to hurt your feelings, but what did you think about all the things that went on during segregation that were so wrong when you were young? That question and the discussion that followed prompted Oki to do the research on the Jim Crow era. Oki continued, I was utterly amazed by the extent of Jim Crow laws as I did research for my book. I cried a lot as I read about that kind of cultural acceptance. She continued, I was not taught about Jim Crow laws in school and throughout my former education. Master's degree, licensed professional counselor certification, mediator certification, 2 state licenses in alcohol and drug abuse, and on and on. Oki poses the question, how can we expect to keep that kind of thing from continuing to repeat itself when we never acknowledged it with past generations, nor do we today? Oki was proud to give her grandson the book that his question inspired. Unfortunately, Oki only had 10 copies printed for a family, and I've recently encouraged her to have more printed. I think every child in grade school should read that book. And it also has beautiful drawings of all of those civil rights leaders. My friend Oki's experience reminded me why governors and state legislators have passed laws prohibiting the inclusion of Black history. To remain ignorant of our history allows horrific laws to be passed unnoticed and without widespread dissent. And those of us who should know our history are not encouraged today to study our past, our resilience, and our contributions to this nation. I recall the late 60s and 70s during the height of the protest in cities around the country. Dr. Martin Luther King had recently been murdered. And we became a renaissance of learning at most universities in the country. I was at the University of Kansas at the time in graduate school, and the university offered prizes for the largest collection of Black books in home libraries. I didn't win. I was very disappointed. A young man, 25 years old, earning a PhD in psychology, won. He's now a professor at the University of California. We also held debates about books that were common at parties. We attended lectures of authors who peddled false narratives about slavery. I recall going to one lecture by Stanley Elkins. He was a professor who peddled the belief that Black slaves in America were docile because they did not leave any slave rebellions. His theory was debunked by many scholars later. I recall going to that lecture and differing with him, but it takes a lot of work to learn that what people are saying is not accurate or that there is a different opinion. And I used to tell the students at Parkland who might complain about a slight or something they felt, it doesn't matter. You can't control your teachers. You're there to learn. And your job is to become smarter if you don't agree. And you read other sources. And that's what I did throughout my graduate career. I did become smarter. I'm sure I wouldn't have gotten the job here at Parkland. I am hopeful that our classrooms will be used to reflect our great nation, and that Juneteenth will be discussed in classrooms in red and blue states so our students will have knowledge about who we are as a nation. And to be honest and say, we are still evolving into that perfect union. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Harris. It's wonderful to hear your reflections. I think it has touched all of us as you reviewed history in ways and that we will remember today.
Oh, it's fine if you're on your way out, but one thing I didn't mention in my nervousness and emotion, there are so many retirees here, and I want to acknowledge you. It was so good to see all of you, faculty and staff. I also want to acknowledge my friends who came in from Chicago, the Collins. They're here. Could you wave? I know you don't want to stand. And also Linda Page, another friend of mine, from here, Jackie Archie, who's here somewhere. Oh, there she is. So thank you all. I didn't tell people to come, but thank you very, very much. I appreciate your support.